I am Dominique, 35 years old, and at Thanksgiving dinner, my own mother called my 6-year-old daughter an ugly black child. She actually slapped my little girl right across the white silk-draped dining table over a cheap toy, then screamed that she was an ungrateful brat who didn't know her place. Just a few weeks later, my parents showed up on my doorstep with fake tears and desperate smiles, begging on their knees on the cold stone floor after witnessing what I had done, a retaliatory strike that caused the family's entire empire to completely collapse and left the elites terrified. Before I share how I brought my toxic family to their knees, begging for mercy, let me know where you're watching this video from down in the comments section. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you've ever had to fight to protect your peace from the very people who were supposed to love you the most. Trigger warning: this story contains instances of verbal and psychological abuse, so please be advised before listening. All names and locations have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. Growing up in Oak Park, Illinois meant you had to live in a world entirely defined by flashy appearances and a suffocating level of superficiality. My mother Brenda and my father Calvin cared about exactly two things in this life: ostentatious and proximity to upper-class whiteness. Our home was a massive brick estate, overflowing with expensive art imported from Europe, elaborately carved furniture, and expectations so stifling they could choke anyone living inside it. My older sister Chantel was the undeniable golden child of the family. She had lighter skin, softer loose curls, and ultimately, she brought home the ultimate prize in my parents' eyes: a white husband named Trent. To my parents, Chantel was the perfect daughter who could never do anything wrong, the one who had elevated the family's social status to a level they had always craved. As for me, I was the dark-skinned daughter. They merely tolerated my existence, putting up with someone who never truly fit into the bourgeois fairy tale they had so meticulously woven. Throughout my childhood years, I was always a ghost in my own home. While Chantel was given expensive ballet classes and private piano lessons, I was banished to the damp basement to clean and study on my own. They called me stubborn, unruly, and too black to wear the pastel dresses my mother favored. Now, at the age of 35, I am a senior director of forensic auditing for a federal financial intelligence agency, while secretly running a massive private equity fund, specializing in acquiring distressed businesses. I hold the power to freeze transnational bank accounts, expose the most complex money laundering schemes, and dictate the fate of billion-dollar corporations with a single signature. But to my family, I was still just a struggling single mother, a lowly accountant who needed to be pitied and given handouts. They had absolutely no idea that I was quietly building a massive financial and power empire in silence. They never asked about my work, and I never volunteered the information. It was always much easier to let them believe their own arrogant prejudices, while I step by step solidified my future and the future of my daughter, Zuri. Zuri is the light of my life. She is 6 years old, possessing gorgeous dark brown skin that gleams like precious mahogany, and natural curly hair that I carefully braided into small, regal plaits. Zuri is smart, confident, and always looks at the world with wide, clear, endlessly curious eyes. I swore to myself that Zuri would never have to experience the feeling of being alienated and abandoned like I once did. I built an invisible fortress around her, shielding her from the vicious insults my family often casually tossed around. My silence throughout all these years was not weakness or resignation. In the world of forensic auditing, silence is the ultimate weapon. When you discover an anomaly in the ledgers, you never scream or alert the fraudster. You stay silent, you gather evidence, you build an irrefutable case, an evidentiary web so tight that when you deliver the final blow, the opponent won't have a single loophole to fight back. And I applied that exact professional principle to my toxic family. Family gatherings were always a psychological torture disguised under a luxurious facade. My father, Calvin, always used these occasions to flaunt his power as a logistics tycoon, even though I knew perfectly well from my secret financial analyses that his company was severely hemorrhaging cash. My mother, Brenda, took every opportunity to brag about Trent, the white son-in-law she considered a tech genius running $1 million startup. In reality, Trent's company was just a hollow shell, a sophisticated Ponzi scheme burning through investors' money and secretly siphoning Calvin's own retirement fund to maintain Chantel's lavish lifestyle. Trent wore custom-tailored designer suits, sported a limited-edition Rolex watch, and always looked down on me, constantly offering bogus financial advice in a condescending, patronizing tone. I simply smiled, a faint, polite and cold smile. I listened to every single lie he told, memorized every number he fabricated, and quietly cross-referenced them with the federal investigation reports, sitting securely in my safe. Chantel always played the queen of the parties. She carried the latest Hermès Birkin bag, flaunted expensive silk dresses, and incessantly bragged about her son Bryce being a prodigy. Bryce was the eldest grandson, the mixed-race child, with white blood whom my parents were always so proud of. Whatever Bryce wanted, Bryce got, and standard rules of conduct seemingly never applied to him. I always sat at the most obscure corner of the dining table, carefully cutting Zuri's food, keeping her out of the line of fire of malicious comments. I was all too used to playing the role of the invisible one. I endured the subtle insults, the sneering glances, and my mother's exasperated sighs whenever she saw Zuri's natural curls. I gathered all of those frustrations, compressing them into a block of solid ice in my chest. That block of ice didn't cause me pain, it only made me more alert, more iron-willed, and more determined to protect my empire until the time was ripe. But every limit has its breaking point, and my breaking point, the moment I decided that the silence for evidence gathering was over, and the death sentence for their fake dynasty officially began, happened on the exact night of Thanksgiving. It was a cold November night, the air outside freezing and gloomy, standing in stark contrast to the flashy, ostentatious display inside the Wilson Estates dining room. The whole place was filled with the scent of spices, expensive scented candles, and the rotten lies that had taken deep root in this family. Thanksgiving dinner was always a grand theatrical production at my parents' house. The long oak dining table was draped in pristine white silk tablecloths, without a single wrinkle. Above it sat high-end gold-rimmed bone china dinnerware and handcrafted crystal glasses reflecting the sparkling light from the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. At the center was a giant turkey roasted to a golden brown, looking so perfect, it resembled a lifeless prop, plucked straight out of a high-society lifestyle magazine. Everything was meticulously staged to show off a fake perfection, concealing the rot smoldering underneath. My 6-year-old daughter, Zuri, was sitting obediently next to her plate, keeping quiet and avoiding bothering anyone. She wore an emerald green velvet dress that accentuated her beautiful dark brown skin, carefully using her little fork to eat every bite of mashed potatoes. Sitting right next to Zuri was Bryce, Chantel and Trent's white-passing eldest grandson, the child who was always pampered and spoiled unconditionally. The trouble started over an iPad tablet. Zuri had been sitting patiently for 20 minutes, obediently playing a digital drawing app on her iPad without making a single noise. Meanwhile, Bryce had quickly grown bored with his pile of expensive toys and started acting up. He stared at Zuri's screen and decided he wanted to play with that iPad. Bryce didn't politely ask for permission, nor did he wait his turn. He simply lunged across the luxurious dining table, reached out, and violently snatched the tablet right out of Zuri's hands, his fingernails clawing a long, bleeding scratch on my daughter's tiny arm during the struggle. Suddenly attacked and in pain, Zuri, with the self-defense instinct of a smart and confident child, quickly grabbed the corner of the iPad and yanked it hard toward herself. It was a completely normal dispute between 6-year-olds, an unnecessary tug-of-war if only a responsible adult had intervened in time. However, the reaction it provoked from the adults around them was absolutely not normal in the slightest. Before I could even push my chair back to intervene and comfort both children, my mother, Brenda, lunged across the giant roasted turkey and the steaming side dishes. Her red manicured hands swung through the air and delivered a stinging, deafening slap down onto Zuri's tiny fingers. The slap echoed dryly, sharp and cold, bouncing off the walls of the massive dining room, completely severing the fake peaceful atmosphere. The sound was sickening. Zuri jolted, gasping in shock, her big dark brown eyes instantly welled with tears, brimming with sheer panic and hurt. She clutched her red hand, bearing the imprint of her grandmother's 5 fingers, tightly to her chest, trembling speechlessly. "Let the boy play," Brenda screamed, her heavily made-up face contorting with an irrational and cruel fury. "You are such an ungrateful and selfish child. You little brat." I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. A cold, razor-sharp chill ran down my spine. The legs of my chair violently scraped against the hardwood floor as I abruptly sprang up. But before I could utter a single word, my father Calvin shook his head in exasperation, slowly cutting the bloody steak on his plate without even looking up at his sobbing granddaughter. "She is always too loud and aggressive," Calvin muttered under his breath, his tone laced with bitter judgment. "You need to re-educate your children, Dominique. Do not bring that uneducated behavior to my dinner table." From across the table, Chantal let out a subtle smirk. She elegantly raised her expensive glass of red wine for a slow sip, her eyes full of smugness and gloating, as if she were watching a cheap yet highly entertaining reality TV show. Brenda, who had slumped back into her chair by now, vigorously wiped her hands with a premium linen napkin, acting as if touching my daughter's flesh had just contaminated her with some disgusting bacteria. "She is just an ugly, jealous little black brat who always wants to start trouble," Brenda muttered loudly, intentionally keeping her volume high enough for everyone in the room to hear. "She needs to learn her place when sitting next to Bryce." An absolute silence enveloped the room right after that sentence, a silence so thick and suffocating it could choke out all oxygen. They were waiting, they were expecting me to go crazy, they wanted me to scream, throw plates, flip the dining table, or cry loudly to create a dramatic scene. They wanted me to behave exactly like the label they had always slapped on me: a failed woman, a weak, impulsive loser who was always out of control and full of resentment. But I didn't scream, I didn't yell or smash anything, I didn't shed a single tear. Instead, I felt an absolute cold and ruthless calmness wash over my mind. It was the kind of terrifyingly clear stillness that appears when you realize a relationship has been permanently, completely and definitively executed. There was nothing left to salvage, there was no more room for mercy. I slowly walked around the long dining table, stepping right up next to Zuri. I gently knelt down, using my thumb to wipe away the tears rolling down her cheeks. I scooped Zuri up, holding her tightly in my arms, kissed her forehead softly, and whispered in the warmest, steadiest voice possible, "You did nothing wrong, my little princess. You are absolutely perfect." I strode out into the hallway, picked up Zuri's little cardigan, draped it over my arm, and then calmly turned on my heel back into the dining room, facing my mother head-on. I looked deep into the eyes that were trying to maintain their arrogant facade, and let my voice sink into an icy, composed and dangerously quiet pitch. "Learn her place, mother," I asked, every word dropping softly but carrying the weight of a 1,000-pound boulder. "Do you mean like how you taught me my place, when you heartlessly drained my entire college savings fund just to pay for Chantal and Trent's ostentatious $500,000 wedding? Or perhaps you meant the way you forced me to sleep in the cold, moldy basement every holiday season, just to spare an entire upstairs bedroom as Bryce's private playroom?" I paused for a beat, smiling. A smile that seemed to freeze the air around us. "You have always hated my dark skin, and it is absolutely killing you from the inside out to see that gorgeous skin present on the angelic face of your own granddaughter. But remember this moment carefully, mother. You have just crossed a boundary that you will never, ever be able to step back from." Brenda's face instantly flushed crimson with a mix of rage and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to retort, to spew more venom to protect her fake aristocratic facade. But right at that moment, Trent, the perfect white brother-in-law, decided this was the absolute best time for him to play the white savior, the voice of reason and diplomacy. Trent stood up, reaching his hand out in a highly condescending gesture, as if coaxing an agitated wild animal. "Come on, Dominique, let's all just calm down a bit. Trent said in that smooth, warm tone reeking of a fraudulent CEO. We are all family here. There is no need to play the race card at a cozy Thanksgiving dinner like this. Do not let emotions override logic. I slowly shifted my gaze to Trent. I scanned him from head to toe with utter contempt, a completely undisguised disgust. Play the race card, I repeated, slowly taking a step toward him. Trent, the only thing being played here is my father's retirement fund. The fund you are draining day by day, hour by hour to maintain the dying pulse of your three fraudulent, rotten tech startups. You are nothing but a black hole of failed investments wearing a rented Rolex. Do not ever open your mouth to speak to me, or my daughter, ever again. The blood instantly drained from Trent's face, leaving his skin as pale as a sheet of paper. He gasped, his eyes widening in sheer panic. From across the table, Chantel's hand went limp, dropping her crystal glass onto the table. The shattering glass echoed dryly, the dark red liquid spilling out like blood, soaking the pristine white silk tablecloth. Calvin, the man who had just judged me a few minutes ago, suddenly choked on the steak in his throat. He coughed violently, glaring at his golden son-in-law, with a profound horror that was slowly taking shape. As a senior director of forensic auditing for the federal government, tracing dirty money flows was ingrained in my instincts. Purely out of curiosity, a few weeks ago, I had secretly run a comprehensive financial background check and forensic audit on all of Trent's business ventures. The financial devastation I uncovered was truly astounding. He wasn't just bankrupt. He was entangled in a web of defrauding investors and embezzling corporate funds so severe that the FBI could knock on his door at any moment. Initially, I had planned to keep this secret buried. I had no intention of interfering with their deadly mess. But they had permanently forfeited their right to my mercy the very second Brenda's filthy hand struck my daughter's face. I didn't linger for another second to intouch-ups, to enjoy the collapse that was beginning to spread through the dining room. I smiled faintly, turned my back on that golden family, and left them to eat each other alive in their beautiful yet overwhelmingly toxic house. I carried Zuri out the front door, stepping down the cobblestone driveway. The sharp, cold air of November hit my face, but I only felt an absolute, pure freedom seeping into every pore of my skin. I carefully placed my daughter into her car seat, wiped away the last tears clinging to her eyelashes, and swore to her that we would never set foot in that house ever again. You are the most beautiful girl in the world, Zuri, I whispered, stroking her hair. And no one, absolutely no one on this earth, will ever be allowed to make you feel small again. Just as I closed the car door and slid into the driver's seat, my phone vibrated violently in my purse. I pulled it out, imagining a barrage of furious, frantic text messages from Chantel, demanding I explain what I had just exposed. Instead, on the screen was an urgent notification sent through a secure encrypted server from my subordinate chief operating officer at Vanguard Apex Investment Fund. I opened the email and skimmed the subject line. A genuine, cold, and calculated smile finally bloomed on my lips. The target took the bait. We have successfully acquired 82% of Sterling Logistics' distressed debt shares. We are now Calvin Wilson's largest creditor. My toxic family, those sitting in the dining room arguing over failed investments and fake reputations, had absolutely no idea about the massive, hundreds of millions of dollars nightmare barreling straight toward them. And the best part, I was the one behind the wheel. My phone screen glowed brightly in the dark bedroom at 6 o'clock the next morning, casting a harsh, cold light across the ceiling. It was the morning after Thanksgiving, and the chaos was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. A thick green wall of text message bubbles from Chantel was incessantly bombarding my notification center. I didn't even need to open those messages to know her familiar script by heart. Chantel aggressively accused me of heartlessly ruining the family's entire sacred holiday. She claimed our mother was suffering a complete breakdown, crying miserably in her bedroom, and facing severe spikes in blood pressure, all because of my unreasonable outburst. Chantel typed paragraph after paragraph, saying that I always had to make everything about race, that I was harboring a deep jealousy toward her perfect marriage. She ordered me to swallow my bitter pride and immediately apologized to Trent for daring to insult his great businesses. Chantel even went so far as to demand that I bring Zuri back to that house, forcing an abused 6-year-old child to kneel and apologize to Bryce for being selfish and refusing to share the tablet. I calmly read those poison-soaked words while pouring organic maple syrup over Zuri's hot plate of pancakes in our sun-drenched kitchen. My beautiful daughter was sitting obediently by the granite kitchen island, softly humming the theme song of her favorite cartoon, completely unharmed and radiating a pure, brilliant joy. I didn't type a single word in response. I simply blocked Chantel's number, placed the phone face down on the cold stone counter, and leaned down to place a gentle kiss on my daughter's forehead. The era of having to explain my dignity to those who constantly chose to misunderstand me was officially closed. Forever. By 9 o'clock Monday morning, I was securely seated behind my custom-designed marble desk in my corner office on the top floor of the financial tower. The endless view through the expansive glass windows spanned across the bustling downtown skyline, serving as a daily reminder of the empire of power I had built with my own hands from absolutely nothing. My investment fund, Vanguard Apex, didn't just manage billions of dollars in assets. It was an undercover force controlling the most ruthless mergers and acquisitions on the market. The walls of my office were decorated with striking contemporary art pieces, and the staff under my command operated like a machine comprised of the brightest legal and financial minds in the country. My parents and sister actually still believed I was just a lowly accountant, spending my days fetching coffee, answering phones, and wrestling with boring Excel spreadsheets. That was because I had intentionally stopped updating them on my career progression 5 years ago. Whenever they asked about my work, it was merely an excuse for them to mock the meager salary they imagined I earned. Therefore, I simply let them drown in their own arrogant and foolish assumptions. Marcus, my subordinate chief operating officer and most trusted assistant, knocked lightly on the glass door and walked in with a tense yet faintly amused expression. He announced that an extremely agitated, panicked woman identifying herself as Chantel was holding on line 3. Chantel was screaming, demanding to speak directly to senior management or the company's human resources team immediately. She had spent the last 10 minutes aggressively telling my receptionist that I was a loud, violent, and psychologically unstable employee who needed to be fired today for the overall safety of the entire corporation. I burst out laughing, the sound echoing off the glass walls in my office. I signaled to Marcus not to hang up, but to redirect my raging sister's call directly to the fund's chief legal counsel. I hit the speakerphone button on my desk so I could fully enjoy the complete destruction of her fragile ego. Chantel instantly launched into a breathless barrage of attacks the second the senior attorney picked up. She deployed every derogatory term, every verbally abusive phrase my mother had taught her to weaponize against other Black women. She called me an uneducated, deranged lunatic, claiming I was a massive financial liability to the corporate culture. She boldly commanded human resources to draft my termination papers right away before lunch, stating my violent behavior at a recent family event had proven I was completely unfit for a respectable, professional work environment. My lawyer maintained absolute silence. He let Chantel squeeze the very last ounce of oxygen from her lungs, allowing her to dig her own grave with her delusional ranting, before responding with a cold professionalism capable of freezing boiling water. He calmly informed Chantel that there were absolutely no managers available to transfer her to, because she was attempting to discipline the founder and CEO of the corporation herself. He explained clearly, word by word, that she had contacted the legal department of a multi-billion-dollar financial intelligence investment fund, of which I was the sole owner. He even threw in a charitable detail, noting that I personally owned the entire commercial building she was calling, and advised her to redirect any further harassment straight to local law enforcement. There was a sharp, panicked gasp on the other end of the line, followed by the dry, stark click of someone fleeing in sheer desperation. I leaned back into my plush leather chair, took a sip of sparkling mineral water, and savored the profound silence blanketing the office. I knew exactly what was unfolding in the manicured suburbs of Oak Park, right at this very second. Chantel was undoubtedly hyperventilating, stumbling around the driveway of the luxury home she would soon be unable to afford. The golden child, the one whose entire identity was built on her proximity to Trent's imaginary wealth and a lifelong superiority complex over me, had just crashed headfirst into a solid brick wall of reality. She had dialed my agency expecting to get me fired, strip me of my livelihood, and forcefully shove me back to the bottom of the family hierarchy. Instead, she discovered she was standing in the mud, gazing up at a dazzling throne I had built with my own hands. Just before noon, my personal cell phone rang. It was an unknown number flashing on the screen. Calvin always used anonymous caller IDs or burner phones from his office whenever he wanted to ambush me. I picked up without saying a single word, letting the silence force him to speak first. Calvin offered no greeting. He didn't ask if Zuri was okay, or if the bruise on her hand had faded. Instead, he snarled out an order using the exact same rigid, condescending authority he had used to control me my entire life. He demanded that I present myself at his private bank downtown, before 3 o'clock that afternoon. Calvin claimed Trent was experiencing a temporary financial hurdle and that he needed me to co-sign a massive business loan immediately. He declared the bank merely needed a second signature with a clean, flawless credit history to clear a minor administrative hurdle. His tone was completely casual and highly presumptuous, acting as if the tear-filled Thanksgiving evening had never even occurred, as if I were still a weak, obedient pawn constantly desperate for his validation. They didn't just want to force me back in line, they wanted to exploit my perfect credit score and my name to rescue his precious white son-in-law from a toxic mountain of debt. I listened to his rapid breathing through the receiver, marveling at this man's absurd level of audacity. When I didn't instantly offer up my signature like a good girl, Calvin mistook my silence for submission. He lowered his voice, employing that patriarchal, preachy tone he always relied on whenever he was about to issue a threat. He told me that family must help family, and if I chose to be selfish and abandon my sister in her time of need, he would have no choice but to officially remove my name from the family trust. He threatened to cut me out of the will entirely, leaving me empty-handed when he passed away. He genuinely believed this was a masterstroke of manipulation. He thought he was dangling my entire future by a fragile thread, waiting for me to drop to my knees and beg for his financial grace. I let out a loud laugh, a sharp sound completely devoid of a single ounce of joy, echoing straight into the microphone. Calvin stammered, clearly thrown off balance by my reaction. I cut him off before he could even try to regain his footing. "You really are incredibly forgetful for someone who always prides himself on being meticulous," I said, my voice freezing cold. "Let me remind you, you cut my name out of your will exactly 10 years ago. You called me a disgrace to your public image, simply because I refused to straighten my natural curly hair for the country club directory photoshoot. You stated bluntly to my face that I would never see a single dime of your money. How can you threaten to take away something you already destroyed a decade ago?" Calvin attempted to backtrack, stuttering to gloss it over with something about how we could mend our relationship if I just showed a little solidarity with Trent. I stopped him dead in his tracks. Trent's massive debt is his own miserable problem. I stated clearly. Trent is the one who stood in your dining room and ordered me to calm down after my mother struck my dark-skinned daughter. I would rather set fire to my own perfect credit score than use it to bail out a terrible, incompetent man who is sucking the blood out of his own father-in-law. I advised Calvin to take a much closer look at Trent's accounting ledgers before he lost absolutely everything. And then I hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. Tossing the phone onto the stone desk, I felt an incredible rush of adrenaline surge through my veins. I didn't waste another second thinking about Calvin or his desperate son-in-law. I signaled for Marcus to step forward and he placed a thick folder on my desk. This was no ordinary commercial contract. This was the legal certification confirming my investment fund, Vanguard Apex had bought out 82% of all distressed debt shares in Sterling Logistics, Calvin's Logistics Corporation. But it seems desperation always breeds the most foolish actions. Less than 2 hours after that phone call, the internal security system at my private mansion triggered an alarm. I lived in a secure gated estate with 24/7 security forces and an extremely strict visitor screening protocol. My parents and sister knew perfectly well they had been permanently banned, following the Thanksgiving incident. But greed and panic had made them reckless. The security team reported that a silver Mercedes was roaring outside the main gate. Inside the car were Trent and Chantel, frantically demanding to be let in. When denied entry, Trent had rammed the front of his car into the security barricade, forcing the guards to open the side gate to prevent a larger collision, while patrol units chased right behind them. I stepped out from behind the closed oak doors, standing on the cobblestone driveway in my front yard. The harsh midday sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The scratched Mercedes screeched to a halt right in front of me, its tires screeching against the stone surface. Trent stepped out. The man who had always prided himself on the flawless appearance of a tech CEO now looked like a madman. His hair was a mess, his designer shirt was disheveled, and sweat was pouring down his forehead. Chantel stumbled out from the passenger side, her eyes bloodshot, her face swollen from crying. Trent ignored the security team rushing up behind him. He charged straight toward me, waving a brown file envelope in the air. "You think you're so smart, Dominique?" Trent screamed, his voice breaking with desperation. "You think you can refuse to sign my guarantor papers and just abandon me? Your father might have been fooled by you, but I am not. You owe me that money." He closed the distance between us with heavy, aggressive steps, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I stood completely motionless, my hands casually tucked into my trouser pockets, looking at him with a blank stare. "I know your secret," Trent growled, pointing a finger inches from my face. "You are laundering money for some syndicate. How else could a single mother like you, a lowly accountant, afford to live in a mansion like this? How do you have a perfect credit score? I hired a private investigator. If you don't immediately co-sign my loan, I will take this file straight to the FBI. I will tell them you are embezzling corporate funds. I will destroy your pathetic life and call the Child Protective Services hotline to strip you of your custody. Zuri will be sent to an orphanage." Chantel stepped up, crossing her arms over her chest, flashing a twisted smirk. "You heard him, you bitch," she hissed. "You were always jealous of me, you always wanted to ruin my life. Pay my husband right now, or your family will officially vanish from this society." They were standing on my property, openly threatening extortion, and using my daughter as a hostage. And they genuinely believed they held the upper hand. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't step back, I just looked straight into Trent's panicked, sweaty eyes and let out a sigh full of pity. "Your investigator did a terrible job, Trent." I spoke up, calm and razor-sharp. I signaled to Marcus, who was standing right behind me, to hand me the tablet. I turned the screen brightness all the way up and aimed it directly at Trent's face. "Take a good look at this," I said. "This is the federal business registration file for Vanguard Apex, one of the nation's largest financial intelligence investment funds. Do you see the sole founder and CEO's name?" Trent narrowed his eyes at the screen. The letters of my name, Dominique Wilson, appeared clearly and crisply. The color on the fraudulent CEO's face vanished instantly. "And this," I swiped to another page, "is the detailed forensic audit report on your 3 startups. Dozens of high-interest loans with no ability to repay. Your illegal siphoning of my father's retirement funds, transferring them into offshore shell accounts. You don't need that loan to grow your business, you need it to cover up your federal crimes before the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, comes knocking." The truth hit Trent like a sledgehammer. The brown folder slipped from his grasp, lying haphazardly on the ground. Chantel gaped, looking back and forth between her husband and my tablet, sheer panic evident on her face. "Dominique, what the hell are you talking about?" Chantel stammered. "I am saying your husband is a federal criminal, Chantel." I smiled coldly. And he didn't just defraud investors, he drained every last penny out of Calvin and Brenda's savings accounts. Chantel seemed entirely unable to process the massive volume of information that had just been slammed into her face. She turned to look at Trent, her eyes wide with absolute horror, hoping he would scream that all of this was just a cruel joke, a fabricated slander, but Trent couldn't utter a single word. He stared blankly at the cobblestones beneath his feet, suddenly looking incredibly small, pathetic, and cowardly. Chantel's arrogance, the flashy facade she had used to trample on me for over 30 years, shattered into fragments right on my driveway. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, desperately searching for another threat, another escape route, but the brutal reality had locked her throat tight. And if you still have any intention of calling Child Protective Services, or taking your fabricated story to the media, I took a step forward, pressing close to Trent, forcing him to step back. My federal legal team will sue you for defamation, extortion, and emotional distress before you can even finish dialing the number. I will personally ensure you never see the sunlight outside of a prison cell. Trent completely collapsed, the selfish survival instincts of a scammer kicked in. He didn't look at his wife even once. He spun on his heel, stumbling back toward the Mercedes, throwing himself into the driver's seat and starting the engine. "Trent, what the hell are you doing?" Chantel shrieked, lunging forward to yank at the car door handle that had been locked from the inside. "Open the door, we have to call a lawyer. We have to fix this." But the man my parents had once praised as their golden son-in-law was nothing but a coward. He threw it into reverse, the car jerking backward violently, the tires screeching against the stone, narrowly missing Chantel's feet. She stumbled and fell face-first onto the rough ground, scraping her knees bloody. Trent slammed on the gas, the car speeding away, leaving his wife screaming and crying in a cloud of dust. Chantel knelt on my cobblestone driveway, clutching her face and sobbing uncontrollably. Her expensive designer silk dress was covered in dirt, her flawless makeup ruined by her tears. Her perfect marriage, her financial future, and her entire illusion of superiority had evaporated right before her eyes. I looked down at her, without a single ounce of pity. "Security," I spoke into the small radio on Marcus's collar. "Escort this woman off my property lines. If she resists, hand her over to the local police." I turned my back, walking inside my mansion, leaving Chantel screaming my parents' names in pure despair. The game wasn't over here, the true punishment was still waiting up ahead. My parents, Brenda and Calvin, were prestige addicts. To them, their public image mattered more than any life, more than any blood relation. Even though Calvin's logistics empire was rotting from the inside out, even though they might have sensed the financial cracks from Trent's constant demands for loans, they still decided to throw a massive event to blind the public's eyes. It was their 40th wedding anniversary celebration, held at the most luxurious and prestigious country club in Oak Park. Hundreds of guests, local politicians, socialites, businessmen, and sycophants had been invited to witness the Wilson family's dynasty. And of course, they had sent me an invitation, not because they wanted me there, but because they wanted to use me as a prop to highlight their perfection. They wanted me to sit at the farthest corner table, silent and submissive, so they could point at me and whisper to their friends about their pathetic, inferior daughter as a way to emphasize the family's brilliant success. They had no idea Trent had fled. They had no idea Chantel was crying and begging banks for help in vain because all her joint accounts had been frozen. And most importantly, they had no idea that the CEO of Vanguard Apex, the creditor that had just swallowed Calvin's entire company, was me. The evening unfolded in a magnificent setting, overflowing with crystal chandeliers and white roses. Melodious classical music filled the massive banquet room. Brenda appeared breathtaking in a crystal-beaded evening gown, her face tightly lifted and heavily made up, smiling radiantly as she strolled around the banquet tables, arm in arm with Calvin. Calvin wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, attempting to project the aura of an invincible tycoon. I walked into the grand hall later than expected, without my daughter Zuri. Tonight was a battlefield, and she didn't need to witness this rot ever again. I wore a sharply tailored, pristine white women's suit, a symbol of cold power and absolute control. No flashy jewelry, no deliberate attempts to draw attention. My presence was quiet, but carried the weight of a submerged iceberg. As I walked in, Brenda's eyes immediately caught mine. She frowned slightly, but quickly regained her aristocratic expression, gliding over to me with a sarcastic, fake smile. "I am surprised you dared to show your face, Dominique," Brenda hissed through gritted teeth, maintaining the smile on her lips so those around wouldn't notice her hostility. "After your shameful performance at Thanksgiving, I thought you'd be too humiliated to step foot into high society." "I merely came to bring you and father an anniversary gift, Mother," I replied, my tone soft but freezing cold. Right at that moment, the event's MC, a longtime friend of Calvin's, clinked a spoon against his champagne glass to catch everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cleared his throat, "today we gather here to honor the 40 years of union between Calvin and Brenda Wilson, pillars of our community, paragons of success and the perfect family." Calvin stepped up to the podium, taking the microphone. He scanned the crowd, his eyes stopping on me for a fraction of a second with blatant contempt, before switching to an expression of profound, fake pride. "Thank you to all our dear friends for being here," Calvin spoke clearly. "Over the past 40 years, my greatest asset hasn't been the region's leading logistics company, but this wonderful family. Despite challenges, we have always been resilient. It's unfortunate that Trent and Chantel had a sudden engagement tonight, but their brilliant success is always our greatest pride." He was lying. His hands holding the microphone were trembling slightly, a sign that he was starting to realize the missed calls from the banks, the notifications from the board of directors about the company being under a hostile takeover. I stood right in the front row, offering a faint smile. I pulled my phone from my suit jacket pocket and pressed a single button. A second later, the hall's audio system crackled with static. The massive projector screen behind Calvin, which was supposed to be playing family montage videos, abruptly went black, and then it flared back to life with massive, crisp text that slapped hundreds of elite guests right in the face. "Wilson Logistics Group, officially bankrupt, assets seized by Vanguard Apex Fund." Murmurs began to erupt like a disturbed beehive. Calvin spun around, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the screen. Brenda stumbled, dropping the glass of champagne from her hand onto the floor. "What is this? Who is playing this sick joke?" Calvin's screamed into the microphone, his fake composure shattering instantly. I slowly walked up the stairs to the podium, the clicking of my heels echoed rhythmically, cold and sharp, cutting through the chaotic atmosphere. I stood face to face with Calvin, unhurried, not raising my voice. I reached out and firmly took the microphone from his violently shaking hand. The entire grand hall fell silent. Hundreds of upper-class eyes were fixated on me, a dark-skinned woman in a pristine white suit, whom most of them didn't even know by name, or only knew as the disappointment of the Wilson dynasty. I held the microphone, my gaze sweeping across the room once, then stopping at Calvin and Brenda, who were standing frozen like stone statues, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Hello everyone," I spoke up, my tone calm, articulate and echoing throughout the lavish banquet room. "My name is Dominique Wilson. To the vast majority of you here, I am just an alienated daughter, an anonymous black sheep that my parents always tried to hide away to protect their perfect image." Brenda lunged toward me, her face pale, trying to snatch the microphone. "What crazy game are you playing? Security, throw her out right now!" she shrieked hysterically, completely casting aside her aristocratic mask. But two tall, black-suited bodyguards I had secretly hired beforehand stepped out of the shadows, gently but firmly blocking her path. I continued, entirely ignoring my mother's panic, and just as Calvin said, this family has always been resilient. But that resilience was built on a rotting foundation of lies, racism, and unforgivable financial crimes. It is a pity that Chantal and Trent couldn't be here tonight. But the reason isn't because they are busy. It is because Trent, the tech genius son-in-law my father is always so proud of, is currently fleeing from an FBI manhunt after embezzling tens of millions of dollars from investors, and most importantly, from Calvin's very own retirement fund. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The elite faces began to whisper and point. The perfect image of the Wilsons officially shattered into fragments. Calvin, I turned to look straight at the trembling man, who was sweating profusely. You begged Vanguard Apex to buy out your bad debts, to save the company from the brink of bankruptcy. You sold out every principal, every piece of collateral, just hoping for a lifeline from a faceless financial intelligence corporation. But you know what? You didn't check carefully to see who was behind that lifeline. I smiled, the smile of a predator that has locked onto its target. I am Vanguard Apex, I declared, every word dropping like a heavy bomb. I am the CEO, the sole shareholder. I bought out your entire logistics empire for pennies on the dollar. I froze every single one of Trent and Chantel's bank accounts. I locked down the entire $600 million fortune, including federal real estate, company shares, and even the ownership of the very house you live in. Calvin took a step back, his legs wobbling. He clung to the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing, his eyes bulging as he looked at me like a monster crawling out from hell. No, it's impossible, you're just an accountant, he stammered, his breath wheezing and choked. Just because I am silent doesn't mean I am not prepared, I fired back, my tone sharp as a razor. You used your wealth to trample on me, to humiliate me, and worst of all, to strike your beautiful dark-skinned granddaughter just over a tablet. You called her an ugly black child and forced her to learn her place. Well then today, right here, in front of your prestigious elite friends, I will show you your true place. I turned my face toward the stunned crowd. The Wilson Logistics Group has ceased to exist. All assets have been liquidated. Their home will be foreclosed by the bank at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and they do not have a single penny left. At that exact moment, the main doors of the grand hall burst open. It wasn't the club's security, but 6 federal agents in windbreakers bearing FBI and SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission logos walking in. Their arrival was like a final finishing hammer blow, smashing any shred of dignity the Wilsons had left. Calvin Wilson, one agent spoke up, holding up a badge. We have a subpoena for you regarding the facilitation of wire fraud and money laundering, tied to Trent's shell companies. Please cooperate. Brenda let out a tragic scream, collapsing onto the velvet-carpeted floor. Her sparkling crystal-beaded dress looked ridiculous and pathetic amidst this chaotic scene. She looked up at her elite friends around her, the people who had once flattered her, but now they all turned away, stepping back as if she were a contagious disease. The country club's board of directors, people who always valued reputation over life itself, immediately stepped forward. A middle-aged man in an elegant suit leaned down and told Calvin, "Calvin, I am very sorry. But according to club rules, your membership is officially revoked effective immediately, due to your involvement in federal criminal investigations. Please leave the premises as soon as you finish speaking with the agents." They were destroyed, completely and utterly, outside in the club's parking lot, after the federal agents temporarily released Calvin because he was, in reality, just a foolish victim exploited by Trent rather than a mastermind. My parents stumbled out into the darkness. Brenda's makeup was smeared, and Calvin's tuxedo was disheveled and tattered. I was leaning against my black bulletproof SUV, waiting for them. Not for pity, but to witness the finale. When they saw me, Calvin and Brenda could no longer maintain an ounce of pride. They understood that I held their financial lifelines in my hands. They dragged themselves toward me, their legs weak. Brenda, the woman who once declared she would never let a stubborn daughter disobey her, now slowly sank to her knees on the freezing asphalt of the parking lot. "Dominique, I am begging you," Brenda sobbed, reaching her trembling hands forward. "I was wrong, I was truly wrong, forgive me, we are family, you can't take our home away. You can't push your parents out onto the street at this age. I beg you, give your father's company back, unlock the accounts." Calvin stood beside her, tears streaming down his aged face. The patriarchal man who had once sworn not to leave me a single dime was now hanging his head, whimpering like a child. "I am sorry, Dominique. I was blind. I will do whatever you want. I will surrender the CEO seat to you. I will transfer all my shares. Just please don't take everything away." I looked down at the two people kneeling before me. I remembered the years of being pushed down into the basement. I remembered their contemptuous glares. I remembered the sickening crack when Brenda's hand struck Zuri's face. I felt no pity whatsoever. My heart was still and cold. "What shares, Calvin?" I offered a faint smile. "You don't have any shares left. I acquired them 100% legally. I sold them off for $600 million, transferring it all into a federal trust fund under my and Zuri's exclusive ownership." "And you get absolutely nothing," Brenda gasped, her trembling hands dropping limply to the ground. Calvin hung his head, covering his face, letting out the choked, sobbing sounds of a man who had been completely crushed. I didn't say another word. I turned my back, stepped into my pitch-black car, and slammed the door shut. The final scene I saw through the rearview mirror was the two of them kneeling on the pavement, isolated, pathetic, and having lost absolutely everything. I drove away without a single backward glance, however. Toxic and greedy people rarely accept defeat easily. Once they had been stripped clean of all their assets, money, and even their social connections, my parents executed one final, incredibly desperate and delusional move. They didn't sue me in court for corporate fraud, because they knew every acquisition document for Vanguard Apex was entirely legal and irreversible. Instead, Calvin and Brenda filed a petition in the federal family court, suing me to demand grandparents' rights. It was a classic, shamelessly nauseating extortion tactic. They demanded the court grant them unsupervised weekly visitation rights with Zuri. The motive behind it was actually very clear. If the court allowed them access to my daughter, they would use her as a psychological hostage, constantly harass me, and eventually force me to set up a multi-million-dollar grandparents' maintenance fund just to get them to leave us alone. They viewed the dark-skinned child they had once called Ugly as a winning lottery ticket, the only remaining tool to salvage their lavish lifestyle, and so we faced off once again, this time, not in a luxurious dining room or a high-society banquet, but in the cold, solemn courtroom of the family court. Calvin and Brenda sat on the opposing side, looking frail and haggard. Brenda wore an outdated knit cardigan, attempting to play the role of a gentle, heartbroken grandmother who had been separated from her beloved granddaughter by an evil daughter. Their lawyer, a cheap hire, rambled endlessly before the judge about my cruelty, about how I had used my massive financial power for a personal vendetta and stripped away the sacred family affection from these two elderly people. I sat in silence beside my top-tier legal team. I didn't frown, I didn't object, I simply let their lawyer a fragile castle of lies. When it was our side's turn to present, my lawyer didn't offer any tearful defensive arguments. He simply stood up, looked straight at the judge, and requested to submit exactly 2 pieces of evidence. The judge nodded, and a large high-resolution screen was rolled into the center of the courtroom. The first piece of evidence was played. The entire gallery fell into absolute silence as the unedited security footage, recorded from a hidden camera in my dining room on the night of Thanksgiving, began to play. My state-of-the-art security system didn't just have crisp visuals, the highly sensitive microphone also captured every true frequency of sound perfectly. The judge adjusted her glasses, staring intently at the screen. She witnessed my little, innocent daughter having her tablet violently snatched away. She witnessed Brenda's face distort with demonic hatred. The sharp sound of the slap echoed straight against the wooden walls of the courtroom, causing even the court clerk to flinch and squeeze his eyes shut. And then came the audio, Brenda's voice dripping with venom, calling Zuri an ugly black brat, followed immediately by Chantel's wicked snicker. Brenda gasped for air, covering her face tightly with both hands, trying to shrink herself as small as possible on the hard wooden chair. Calvin hung his head down on the table, completely drained of life. Even their cheap lawyer closed his eyes and massaged his forehead, instantly realizing his career was permanently tarnished for getting involved in this racially charged child abuse case. But my lawyer didn't stop there. He slid a thick file folder onto the judge's bench. "Your Honor, Exhibit B," my lawyer declared. "This is an exact timeline of the plaintiff's sudden interest in their granddaughter." This folder contains audited financial reports proving that Calvin Wilson's logistics company went bankrupt. Their home was foreclosed by the bank, and they became completely penniless. Your Honor, the undeniable truth is that Calvin and Brenda Wilson never attempted to visit, never sent a birthday card, and never made a single phone call to little Zuri, until exactly 48 hours after their net worth hit zero. He paused for a beat, emphasizing every single word. This is not familial love. This is a malicious and sinister extortion attempt, disguised under the veil of grandparents' rights. The judge closed the file folder. She took off her glasses and slammed them down on the wooden desk. The atmosphere in the courtroom became incredibly thick and overwhelmingly tense. When she spoke, her voice was dangerous, quiet, and vibrating with the profound indignation of a true lawmaker. She looked straight at Calvin and Brenda, her gaze pinning them then down to their cheap chairs. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such a disgusting and sickening manipulation of the family court system, she declared. She shredded their dignity with words as sharp as a scalpel. She called their lawsuit an abuse of the legal process for crude extortion and profiteering. She pointed her finger right in Brenda's face. Anyone who dares to strike an innocent child and uses vile racial slurs to humiliate her has permanently forfeited every moral and legal right to be present in that child's life. The judge picked up her wooden gavel and delivered the final rulings. The petition for visitation rights was dismissed entirely. Furthermore, because this lawsuit was determined to be malicious and harassing in nature, the court ordered Calvin and Brenda to pay 100% of the massive legal fees for my corporate legal team. The total amount was so large that it would wipe out the last few $1,000s remaining in their emergency retirement fund. They were officially financially leveled, no company, no house, no assets, and now not even a single dime left to survive the next week. The judge's gavel struck with a sharp crack, declaring the adjournment of the court session, and simultaneously sealing the absolute financial death sentence of the Wilson dynasty. I stood up, calmly brushing off the invisible wrinkles on my perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and strode out of the courtroom without looking back even once. The hallway outside was flooded with brilliant afternoon, sunlight streaming through the massive arched windows. I stood waiting in front of the elevator, escorted by my private security detail, my demeanor as still as a winter lake. A moment later, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom burst open, and Calvin and Brenda stumbled out into the hallway. They looked entirely broken, their bodies appearing to have aged decades in just a single hour. They were whispering frantically to each other, completely paralyzed by the brutal reality of the massive legal fees they had just been ordered to pay. They saw me standing by the elevator and suddenly froze. For the first time in my entire life, they were no longer looking at me with disgust, disappointment, or condescending arrogance. Instead, they looked at me with the purest, most primal fear. They knew I held absolute life or death power over their future, and they knew my mercy had been completely drained to the very last drop. I slowly walked toward them, the clicking of my heels echoing rhythmically and sharply on the marble floor. Instinctively, they backed away until their backs hit the cold stone wall of the hallway. They had nowhere left to run. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat or mock them. I maintained the deadly composure of an apex predator at the top of the corporate food chain. I reached into my designer leather briefcase and pulled out one final pristine white envelope. I stepped right into Calvin's personal space, forcing him to look me straight in the eye, and pressed the thick document firmly into his chest. Calvin's violently shaking hand accepted it. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Brenda inched closer, her eyes wide with a mix of sheer horror and desperate anticipation. With the level of public destruction I had orchestrated, she was probably expecting a massive countersuit, a demand to seize all remaining personal belongings or a full declaration of bankruptcy. But instead, Calvin slowly broke the seal. His trembling fingers pulled out a meticulously and flawlessly drafted legal contract. He read the bolded subject line, and his deeply wrinkled forehead furrowed in profound confusion. I intentionally took a step back and let the reality of that document drown them. I explained the exact parameters of my final offer with a terrifying apathy. The document they were holding was a combination of an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, NDA, and a highly restricted, heavily monitored financial trust fund. I told them I was fully aware that the judge had just ordered them to liquidate their last remaining personal savings to pay my massive corporate legal fees. I knew they had no home to return to, no secret offshore accounts to siphon, and absolutely no social network willing to offer them a guest bedroom. They were exactly a few hours away from the tragedy of homelessness. I watched Brenda gasp, her hands covering her mouth, as she fully comprehended the sheer magnitude of the poverty closing in on them. I informed them that I had authorized a modest monthly stipend to be disbursed from an anonymous subsidiary of my investment group. I clearly spelled out the mathematical structure of this stipend. It was calculated down to the exact penny. It provided precisely enough capital to cover the rent for a basic, dilapidated two-bedroom apartment in a poor working-class neighborhood on the furthest outskirts of the city. It only covered standard utilities, the most essential groceries, and public transportation transit passes. There was absolutely no surplus for country club membership fees, no budget for designer knit cardigans, and completely no allocation for luxury vehicles or restaurant dinners. It was a strictly enforced survival budget, but the condition to receive this pathetic financial lifeline was absolute and entirely non-negotiable. I locked eyes with Brenda, ensuring my words pierced right through the armor of denial she had hidden behind her entire life. In exchange for this monthly deposit, I declared coldly, "You must sign away the right to ever utter my name, or my daughter's name, ever again. You are strictly forbidden from accepting television interviews, forbidden from publishing memoirs, and forbidden from posting on any social media platforms regarding me, my company, or my child. If you dare utter a single syllable about Zuri to anyone, whether in public or private, this stipend will be immediately and permanently revoked, leaving you to fend for yourselves in the gutters." Calvin stared at the contract, his eyes scanning over the unforgiving legal terminology. The silence in the courthouse hallway became heavy, broken only by Brenda's ragged, coarse breathing. For a brief second, I saw a flash of the old Calvin, the arrogant patriarch, ready to rip the paper in half and declare his proud independence. But the spark in his eyes extinguished as quickly as it appeared. The brutal reality of complete financial destruction had nailed his feet to the marble floor. He had no leverage, he had no power, he was now just a beggar holding out a chipped bowl, begging for scraps from the very daughter he had spent his entire life trampling on. Brenda reached out, her carefully manicured fingers digging into Calvin's arm. She looked at him with an expression of pure, absolute defeat. She knew they had exhausted every possible avenue of manipulation. The TV cameras were gone, their rich friends had turned their backs, the judge had stripped them of their last defensive weapon. They had nothing left but the cruel, humiliating grace I was choosing to bestow. Calvin reached into his breast pocket and slowly pulled out a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. He turned to face the cold stone wall of the hallway, flattening the contract against the smooth surface. His hand shook violently as he signed his name on the designated line. Then, he handed the pen to Brenda. She didn't bother looking at me. She kept her eyes glued to the marble floor as she scribbled her signature next to her husband's name, officially and permanently erasing themselves from the story of my life. I stepped forward, gently slipping the contract out of Calvin's hand. I glanced over to verify the signatures with a nonchalant attitude. I offered no comforting parting words. I didn't deliver a final insult either. Their absolute silence was the only closure I required. I turned my back on the people who gave birth to me and walked away. The brilliant afternoon sun poured through the massive arched windows at the end of the hall, bathing the corridor in a warm golden glow. My security team followed closely at my heels. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the main lobby, and watched the heavy metal doors slide shut together, permanently sealing Calvin and Brenda in a dark past. Exactly. 1 year later, the harsh, sterile light of the family court had become a distant memory belonging to another lifetime. I was standing in the center of an animation studio flooded with natural sunlight, located on the top floor of a commercial building, recently acquired by the Vanguard Apex Fund, in a bustling arts district. The walls were painted with vibrant, energetic colors. The polished concrete floors reflected the light beautifully. The space echoed with the passionate, joyful working sounds of 30 highly paid animators, scriptwriters, and audio engineers. This was the crown jewel of the entertainment subsidiary I had just founded. I was wearing a flawless emerald green pantsuit, holding a tablet displaying quarterly growth projections that continued to shatter all industry expectations. My corporate empire had expanded exponentially, completely absorbing and restructuring the logistics group I had stripped from Calvin. But this studio had nothing to do with gross profit margins or hostile takeovers. This space was entirely dedicated to creativity and nurturing dreams. I walked past rows of state-of-the-art digital drafting tables, exchanging genuine smiles and collaborative ideas with my creative directors. The atmosphere was built on absolute mutual respect, a stark contrast to the toxic fear-based regime my father had maintained for 3 decades. I had created a corporate culture where talent was nurtured, not exploited. At the far end of the studio, in a sun-drenched alcoves surrounded by massive canvases and premium art supplies, sat the greatest achievement of my life. Zuri was sitting on a tall wooden stool, her legs kicking with excitement while she eagerly painted. She was now 7 years old and looked absolutely radiant. Her natural hair was styled into gorgeous thick puffs, framing her expressive and joyful face. She was wearing a bright yellow apron, splattered with vivid streaks of acrylic paint. Completely unbothered by the mess, Zuri let out a loud, unrestrained laugh as one of the senior animators made a funny face at her, while rendering one of Zuri's original character designs on a massive digital screen. I stood motionless and watched her, my chest tightened with an infinite, profound sense of peace. Zuri was blossoming brilliantly in a way I had never been allowed to as a child. She was completely untouched by generational trauma, racist microaggressions, and the suffocating toxicity of the country club lifestyle that had once defined my youth. She didn't know what it felt like to shrink herself to please insecure relatives. She didn't know the sting of a slap from a grandmother, or the cruel, mocking laugh of an aunt. Zuri only knew unconditional love, boundless creative freedom, and an absolute belief that she was incredibly smart, beautiful, and deeply cherished. I had meticulously eradicated every single threat, no matter how small, to her happiness. Tonight was the official premiere broadcast of the animated series authored by Zuri herself. This show was entirely based on the magical, vibrant characters she had started drawing in her sketchbooks when she was just 4 years old. I had funded this project, hired the best executive producers in the industry, and transformed her pure, untainted imagination into a high-quality educational show for children all around the world. As the sun set, the studio transformed into a massive celebration party. The catering staff laid out a buffet of exquisite dishes. The room was packed with our chosen family, my fiercely loyal executive team, Marcus, the talented animators, and a diverse community of true friends and mentors who loved Zuri exactly for who she was. There was no forced polite conversation, no hidden agendas, and absolutely no fake social climbing. It was a room filled only with genuine joy. Zuri spotted me from across the room and dropped her paintbrush. She ran toward me with her arms wide open, her clear laughter ringing out, overpowering the music. I dropped to one knee, catching her and pulling her into a tight, fierce embrace. She smelled sweet like strawberries and fresh paint. Zuri wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and told me she loved me. I kissed her forehead and told her I loved her more than my own life. I picked my daughter up, resting her on my hip, and looked out over the incredible world I had built with my own hands. The painful battles in oak-paneled boardrooms or cold courthouse hallways now felt like ancient history. I didn't just survive the grueling crucible my family had forced me to endure. I had completely conquered it. I looked at the bright, solid future stretching out before my daughter, and I knew one absolute truth. I didn't just protect her peace, I bought the entire kingdom, leveled its rotting foundation, and built a fortified, eternal sanctuary to replace it. True power isn't found in craving validation from those who refuse to see your worth, but in the quiet, persistent work of building your own kingdom with your own hands. When you stop chasing validation from toxic people and start nurturing your own ambitions, you reclaim the power that always belonged to you. The betrayal from those closest to you can be incredibly painful, but it is often the very catalyst that forces you to outgrow the tiny, cramped boxes they had built for you. Remember, you do not need their permission to shine brilliantly. You just need the courage to walk away, leave them behind, and build something infinitely more wonderful on your own terms. If you have ever had to build your own success despite your family's doubts and disdain, please share your story in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of resilience and triumph.